For many years now, I've been a fan of the Bandai S.H Monsterarts line, and I can safely say over the years I've amassed a pretty extensive collection of the figures. In the instances where Bandai has lacked in providing figures that I wanted, or versions of figures I've wanted, I've supplemented the collection with things like NECA, Revoltech, Shogoken, and even some bootleg figures. I've also picked up a few of the Super7 Ultimates figures over the years. They've never really blown me away, but I really do like the character choices they make. So while I'm not heavy in collecting the line, I do keep an eye on it as they put out new releases. So that means just one thing. They announced they were getting into the Godzilla series, I was very excited. Particularly with the announcement in the first wave they were doing that they were tackling the Rose version of Biollante, which is something that Monsterarts has not given us. However, one of the catches with the Super7 Ultimates is that these come in an 8-inch scale, so they're about 2 inches taller than our normal Monsterarts releases. However, with Biollante, I didn't see this being as much of an issue because the Monsterarts Biollante is a bit on the small side, and having a larger figure honestly wouldn't be a bad thing in this scenario. They also announced they were making one of the figures that I've wanted to see in the line for a long time, one that I was hoping that Monsterarts or NECA would have given us, which is Meltdown Godzilla from Godzilla vs. Destroyah. They bill this one as the 1200 degrees Celsius version of Godzilla, and it's just a crazy design of Godzilla mid-meltdown with bone exposed and melting flesh. So these figures are 2 or 3 waves apart. I was a little late picking up Biollante because when I saw it at my local comic shop, I have to admit, I wasn't super impressed with the detail on it. It's exactly what I expect from Super7 with their Ultimate figures. They are very cartoony. Most of the ones that I have from them, that I've seen from them, are usually based on cartoon shows from the 80s or 90s, so they kind of have that aesthetic to them. And that's fine on their own, but as someone who wanted to try to incorporate these in with my Monsterarts figures, I was just left a little bit wanting seeing this, especially that these are in the about $90 price range. It makes them feel a little cheap for what they are. Biollante in particular, though she does come with some swap out parts and added bits, it's a very lightweight figure, so there's no heft to it at all. It just is kind of nothing to pick up, which makes it feel a little bit cheap too. As I mentioned, the sculpt is a little soft, the paint's a little bit lacking. We do get a little bit of shading here on the leaves. There's maybe a little bit of color variation in throughout the plant life in the chest there, or the body, whatever you want to call that, but the rose itself is a little flat. And then places where you'd kind of just expect articulation, they don't have articulation. Like the mouth on here is a solid sculpt. And then to have Biollante open her mouth, you have to pop on an entire different rose onto the front of the figure. Feels like it wouldn't have been too hard to engineer those teeth to move and have them close, but it's an interesting choice here. The head is on like a ball joint. These leaves can swivel and then hinge up and down, so you can kind of pose them around. The leaves right behind the rose itself, like these ones, are all built into the head sculpt for what it is. Down lower, we have her individual tendrils. So we get 4 kind of just plain tendrils, like the just pointy-ended ones. And then we have 2 tendrils with the jaws on them. The jaws here are actually articulated. You can open them up. Actually, maybe a little too articulated because you can kind of get them to cross-bite pretty easily, but still, they're fine for what they are. They can rotate. They got multiple joints throughout as well, where you can rotate as well as hinge them, so you can get the little Venus flytraps going off in different directions. But they also have a similar peg into the body for all of them, so I actually moved, I think it was this one. It was further back on the figure when I initially unboxed it, and I moved a little further forward just to give it a bit more of an aggressive look. So you can kind of swap them out to make them fit how you want them to. You can also unpeg these, And I would say you could peg on these other ones that have like a break apart effect. These pieces do kind of puzzle piece together, but they don't want to hold at all. So I think it's really meant to be just that you have the bloody stump left on Biollante herself, and then you can kind of just toss one of the burnt off heads on the floor. It's cool in terms of having a gimmick. I know the Godzilla that released alongside this one also had, I think, the tendrils going through his hands, which I thought was with the fight with the final version of Biollante, not this version of Biollante, but it's still kind of an interesting idea to give him that accessory. I think overall I'm probably going to just take these and have them kind of on the ground as set dressing, and then leave the normal ones pegged in, because she has more mouths than this anyway in this form. So I think it would just make more sense that like she's got those, and then we have some dead ones laying around. These tendrils do fall off really easily as well, which is not great. And then I thought maybe the normal tendrils had a similar joint where I could add in the extra mouths, but that's not the case. Doesn't have a whole lot going on with the backside there. You do also have a joint here at the top. I missed this completely, but I guess you'd call that like an upper torso joint, so you could aim her head around a little bit more. But I mean, it's overall a pretty static character in the movie anyway, so I'm not too surprised it's a pretty static figure. No light feature or anything going on in the chest, nothing going on the bottom, not that you'd really need it. I think with a little bit of paint, this thing could be really cool, but it just kind of feels a little bare bones for the price point. The 1200 degrees Celsius Godzilla is at least a little heftier feeling. Not by a lot. It's really not any heavier than like a NECA figure would be, but it does feel a bit more substantial. The sculpting on this is still a little bit soft, a little bit of that cartoony style, but to me it's forgivable being in this mid meltdown mode. You can see the skull there on the one side. It's got great orange translucent plastic throughout, giving it that kind of melted flesh look. Flip him around to the other side, you see his eyes like glowing yellow. There's a bit more of his actual like flesh still on there. The dark gray flesh of Godzilla, but you have a lot more of that meltdown effect going on through it. Looks like he's dripping and everything. However, it's another scenario where I feel like it'd be cool to open the jaw. Jaw does not open at all. However, we do get an additional head here too. Man, these heads are hard to peg on here. But that is a full skull head for Godzilla. And I should point out, I didn't realize before, I hadn't swapped the head out yet, the peg is that same bone color. So if you do see it through the translucent orange, it does have like the effect of a skeleton being there. It's kind of cool. This one I really like the detail on. I think they did a great job with it. There's a nice wash to it. And that one does have an articulated jaw, so you can actually have him like screaming in pain in his last moments. So that's a really cool option to have. I think I'm going to keep the other head on him most of the time, and maybe have this like on the ground of the display as a skull, like he's already died, but still a very cool look. The overall detail kind of just continues throughout. Everything is very kind of loose in form. It has that melting look. Even going down to his back, you can see all the spines are kind of melted and flowing down his back. Bits of his skin are kind of exploded out. Still little bits of the charcoal gray underneath, but overwhelmingly it is a glowing orange mess. You see his chest is ripped away. You could see the beginnings of his kind of sternum there. Some yellowish stuff behind, which I guess is supposed to be his organs or whatever going on there. His right arm is still mostly intact. You can see the fingers have melted away, exposing bone, but there's still, flesh or whatever's left of it there up the arm. But on his left side, it is just skeletal going all the way down, which is a nice bit of kind of asymmetry that I think really makes his figure look cool. And I kind of like that as we get lower down on the figure, it looks a little bit more like the traditional Burning Godzilla, especially here on his right side. You can see a lot more of his normal skin tone coming through, and kind of those bands that he had in the Burning Godzilla look. Though his other side, while it is still darker than a lot of the rest of the figure, there's still some bone poking out, his foot's starting to melt away, so it just gives this really cool uneven look to his meltdown. The pelvis isn't quite as translucent as everything else. I think it's just because there's a lot of stuff connecting in there, so it kind of makes it not look quite the same. The tail is pretty cool as well. It's multi-segmented. You continue those melting down spines here in the back, and then you still have that darker coloration here, and then as it gets towards the end, it becomes lighter orange, and then we kind of finish out with just bone. I was a little confused at first how the tail lined up, because you can kind of line the spines up going down to about here, and then the spines really disappear and then becomes the tail. There is this glob down here, and at first I thought it was one of the spines, and then I realized I think it's actually supposed to be like gravity melting down the tail there. So, you know, it kind of becomes very ill-defined as to what you're looking at in terms of up, down, whatever, as you get to the very end there, but I think that really works, and it gives it a cool look. So I mentioned the jaw articulation. The head has like a ball joint going on. Then you have a ball joint at the mid neck and at the lower neck. The lower neck's not super articulated besides side to side, but you can get a decent range of motion out of the head there, which is really cool. The arms have a ball joint at the upper arm. You can go up and down a very tiny amount. It looks like it should go further, but mine does not want to. The one side goes further. I don't know if it's the construction of his other side is hindering it or if mine's just stuck. I'm not going to force it too much more. On his left side, you have a bicep swivel. You have a single joint at the elbow. You could also swivel at the elbow. You could swivel and bend in and out at the wrist. I guess it's really the same articulation on the other side, but it's just much skinnier. So you have a little bone articulation there. You could bend at the elbow still, rotate, and bend the hand too. This waist joint is a ball joint, I think, but really you get a lot of swivel out of it and not a lot of other motion. The legs can kick forward and back. Go a little bit out to the side, but not a lot. It's really a ball joint, so you can't really swivel particularly there. Really limited bend at the knee. You could swivel at the knee. The foot can bend up and down. You could rotate as well. And like I mentioned, there's ball joints all throughout the tail, so you can get a pretty good range of motion out of it there. Just a lot of different segments. They're not quite as loose as a Monsterarts would be, so I feel like you can move them, but you can't get the same amount of range per joint as you can with a Monsterarts. It does get a little more flexible here at the end, but not by a whole lot. And I think that's mostly just because it kind of has a forced bend here with the way it's sculpted to get that arch in his tail, and that kind of just leaves a little extra room in the joints to move things. So here's our Biollante comparison, and yeah, if I thought the coloration looked a little dull on the Super 7 one initially, seeing it next to the Monsterarts version really pushes that into my head because, oh man, the Monsterarts version just looks so cool. It's just such nice subtle shades of green in there. It looks so much cooler than the Super 7 one. I mentioned before, the rose form is a bit taller. You can see that's true here, but I believe it's been a minute since I messed with Biollante. But yeah, we can extend her neck up, which means we have to extend the camera up. So she can be a bit taller, but it actually puts these two not in terrible scale with one another. You can see the heads on the vines for the Monsterarts are significantly smaller than the ones for the Super 7. And all around the details just nicer and sharper on the Bandai one, but they're not super out of scale with one another. And not that I use light up gimmicks much on any figure I own, but seeing the kind of weird semi-translucence they gave the stomach of the rose form, it just feels like it's begging for a light up feature like the Bandai one. Not necessary, but it would have been cool. And then there we could see it with the Monsterarts Godzilla 89 and the Super X2. And again, I think the scale actually works decently. I was half tempted to bring in that light and sound version of 89 that they did way long ago, but honestly, I think they kind of work together better at this scale. The other figure would be more in line with the head of the rose, and I feel like that's out of scale. Biollante was a lot bigger than Godzilla during that fight, both their fights, so I think it works well to have, you know, these smaller Godzilla figures. So this is one place where the scale is actually going to benefit us, I think. For Godzilla, here's his height comparisons with some Monsterarts versions. We have, I think this was the Comic-Con Explosion version on the left, and the Burning Godzilla 2.0 on the right, with the Destroyah crab making a cameo. And I think the angle of my camera is hiding how these really look right now. Let me move that a little bit. Yeah, it's a bit more accurate. So they definitely are significantly smaller in height. But for the longest time, I've been using this Comic-Con Explosion version as my stand-in for Meltdown Godzilla because it was the closest thing we had. And I think I'm still going to try to make this guy work on my display because it just feels like it should be there. It's just such a cool cool look. I don't really care that it's out of scale. It is just a neat idea. I'm just starting to worry looking at it now, looking at the tail and how limited articulation is. I really don't know if this is going to fit in a Detolf. And then just for a slightly different look, that's I believe the Rebirth Godzilla. It may not be. I may have used the Rebirth somewhere else, and this is like one of the other releases. I don't remember anymore, but it is the more standard early Godzilla body, which I guess the Comic-Con explosion was too, but just to give you a more traditional Godzilla look next to it. Well, both shelves were tight fits to get the figures back onto, but I managed it. I'm glad to have a rose form of Biollante. Biollante is one of my favorite monster designs in the Godzilla franchise. I think it's really neat. I adore the Bandai Monsterarts version of this character. The Super 7 one, I feel like it's a placeholder. I like having it. I think it really does fill out this shelf nicely to have that version of the character. It really feels like it's a complete Biollante shelf now, but if Monsterarts said they're putting up their version of the rose form on pre-order, this thing would go on eBay so fast I wouldn't even think twice about it. Man, even when it was just a couple figures on this shelf, it was so hard to get Godzilla facing Biollante. Now it's like impossible. Oh well. Close enough, I guess. I don't like his head being turned that much. Guess we'll mess with it more later. So yeah, like I can't really recommend this rose form of Biollante, and I feel like it's going to be on clearance eventually because I think a lot of people are unimpressed with it, but I think it'll do for now. And if my Biollante shelf was crowded because of the size of the characters in it, my Destroyah shelf is crowded because of the quantity of characters on it. And actually, I just realized my freeze and heat mazers I left on my display in the other room. Not that they take up a whole lot of room, there's plenty of space for them, but I still don't have everything back on this shelf. And honestly, from some angles, you can't even see Meltdown Godzilla back there. But this one, despite it not being in scale with everything else on this shelf, I think is really cool. I think as a unique piece, it works really well. I don't really think Bandai is ever going to give us this version of the character. I feel like Rose Form Biollante is a lot more likely, and this is more of something you kind of need a different company to come in and do because it's just too weird for Monsterarts to do. And honestly, Monsterarts, I don't know if I trust them with something as spindly as like the bone parts on this, because they'd probably try to make it a little too realistic, and I feel like they'd be really fragile. So maybe better to stick with the Super 7 here. I feel like I can recommend this thing because just on its own, it's a nice display piece. It's a super iconic moment in the Godzilla franchise, and I think it works well as that. So while I'm less enthusiastic about the Rose Form Biollante, I really do like this version of Godzilla, and I think it's worth picking up. But let me know in the comments below. Have you tried any of these Super 7 Ultimate figures? Are there ones coming out you're excited about? Are there other ones that fit in well with Monsterarts that I haven't messed with? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time. Later.